right. Erik Molvar, Boone Kauffman, thanks so much for the conversation today about sage grouse. I look forward to it.
All right.
It's always good to talk about sage grouse.
Always. And the sage and their habitat.
Boone, let's start with you. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us about your background and what you do in the world?
Sure. My name is Boone Kauffman. I am a recently retired professor from the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. And I'm also the lead scientist of Illahee Sciences International, which is a small consulting firm dedicated to providing information and education and outreach on land use issues, ecological restoration issues, and climate science issues for ecosystems throughout the world. We work in such diverse places as the Steens Mountain, Yellowstone National Park, the Amazon, and Borneo at the moment. So uh, my background training, though, actually is in range management. I got early degrees in range management and a PhD in forestry, and have spent, the last 40 or 50 years conducting research and educational activities focusing on restoration ecology, impacts of livestock, and their role in climate change, and how land use, land cover change interacts with and influences climate change throughout, and as well as issues on biodiversity throughout the Western United States.
Erik, over to you. Please introduce yourself, your background, and if you could tell the audience about Western Watersheds Project.
Well, my name is Erik Molvar. I'm the executive director of Western Watersheds Project. I'm also a wildlife biologist, and my field research was in moose behavioral ecology and impacts of moose herbivory on ecosystem dynamics in Alaska. And after that, I wound up for a while as executive director of Biodiversity Conservation Alliance in Laramie, Wyoming for about 13 years. And then moved on to Wild Earth Guardians, where I was their sagebrush sea campaign director, specializing in sage grouse and lesser prairie chickens for about 3 years, and then came over to Western Watersheds Project in 2016. Been here ever since. And Western Watersheds Project is a nonprofit conservation group that works to protect and restore wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. The organization has a long history of involvement in the sage grouse issue, dating clear back into the 2000s, when WWP successfully sued against the decision not to list the greater sage grouse under the Endangered Species Act, and compelled the agency to issue a new finding, which was warranted for listing but precluded by other priorities. And from there, we've been very active in litigating on sage grouse plans that have come up to be inadequate despite our best efforts to advocate for strong plans, and oil and gas leasing and livestock grazing inside sage grouse priority habitats.
Great. And I should probably introduce myself as well. I'm Adam Bronstein. I'm the Oregon director with Western Watersheds Project, and Erik already gave some information there about WWP, but I've been with the organization now for 5 years. I started as the Idaho director and then moved over to Oregon and Nevada, and now I am just covering Oregon, which is plenty of space on its own. So, what is the greater sage grouse? I'll have to admit that I didn't know much about the bird before coming to WWP, but I've taken a fire hose drink now, I'd say. But what is the sage grouse?
Well, I'll start with that one.
Yeah,
The
go ahead.
greater sage grouse is a bird about the size of a duck that lives out in the sagebrush. It's a sagebrush obligate. It is it's a gallinaceous bird. So, like grouses and ptarmigans in many different types of habitats, it breeds at a lek every year traditionally, where the males will show up and strut. They puff out their chest sacs, which are lined with these brilliant white feathers, and they have these egg yolk shaped pouches that make this sound that goes bloop, 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 that can carry over many miles. and they're really an iconic sagebrush obligate species. So if you can protect enough habitat to have a thriving sage grouse population, there are a variety of other sagebrush species that will also be able to thrive. And Boone, what would you like to add to
Yeah,
that?
yeah, no, I would say very much the same. They're I think one of the iconic species of the Western United States, particularly the sagebrush landscape. They are, few people get. I mean, just to see one is always exciting. To be on the lek is truly one of the great experiences of any outdoor person's life in the sagebrush. They are remarkable birds in that they do live in this pretty harsh environment. They and they're great indicators of ecosystem health. When you have a so healthy sagebrush population, you have a pretty healthy rangeland landscape. Um, and so, again, where we have seen the greatest population numbers, of course, are in areas that have healthy sagebrush and also healthy riparian zones, since they particularly will utilize these streamside habitats during the summer when that's a very abundant source of insects for young brooding uh, uh, females and their chicks.
Sage grouse populations have dropped about 80% over 6 decades or so. Do we know what is responsible for this decline?
Well, I think that the bottom line is habitat degradation, the loss of habitat, the fragmentation of habitat uh, due to land use in their habitats, and this would be, roads, uh, uh, oil field development, uh, but largely, and I think the most widespread cause of degradation of sage grouse habitat throughout its range would have to be livestock grazing, domestic livestock grazing on our public lands, and or conversion of some of the most productive sage grouse habitats into hayfields, grasslands, and or the loss of the native flora and fauna due to increases in exotic species, also ultimately related to overgrazing by domestic cattle.
So, how specifically does grazing harm sage grouse? I'll throw that over to Erik.
Well, sage grouse need to have a certain level of grass cover in between the sagebrush in order to hide from their predators. And if you've ever spent much time out in the sagebrush steppe, you'll know that sage grouse spend a lot of their time waddling around on the ground. And they're an ungainly bird, and yet they really survive by camouflage. So they have this brilliant camouflage scheme that's almost impossible to see. I can't tell you how many times I've been out there with a camera trying to sneak up on a sage grouse hen that's waddling through the brush that I've just seen. And then by the time I get my camera focused and pointed in the right direction, the bird has just vanished without flying at all. They just waddle off, and you can't find them because they've got such brilliant camouflage. But the way the camouflage works is that it also requires you to have enough grass height in order to hide. If you denude the vegetation in between the sagebrush, as cattle grazing often does, then the birds become exposed to their native predators and obvious to sight, and then they're easily picked off. And so that's the major impact of livestock grazing, is to take off the cover between the sagebrush. But when the grazing gets severe enough, then you also have the invasion of flammable weeds like cheatgrass, like ventonata, like Medusa head wild rye. And if you do get rid of those native perennial bunch grasses that provide the natural cover and replace them with these invasive weeds, the weeds are highly flammable. They're annual plants that grow for maybe 6 weeks in the spring, dry off, turn brown, and become tinder for fires. And when the fire comes, it doesn't just take out the cheatgrass, and it doesn't just take out the native grasses that remain. It also takes out the sagebrush. And sagebrush plants don't sprout from stumps the way some shrubs do. after fire. So they are functionally eliminated for the long term until they reseed again from distant seed sources if you have one of these big fires. So once you get a large amount of cheatgrass built up in the understory beneath the sagebrush and that burns, you're going to convert that into a cheatgrass monoculture, which has no habitat value for sage grouse and is highly prone to frequent recurring fires, which will then keep the sagebrush from getting reestablished.
Yeah. And it's also true. I think that, we can carry that a little bit further, since we have the time, that the livestock, do their first order effects are they're removing the forage, exposing nests to greater rates of predation. But also, these are ecosystems that really didn't evolve with large herbivores. They're very, very sensitive to grazing. And as you start to see a decline in composition, an increase in these exotic annuals that Erik was talking about, you're also seeing the loss in many of the key sage grouse forage species. It's true that they eat predominantly, or a great deal of their diet in the winter is sagebrush, but in the summertime, they're eating forbs, they're eating seeds of very many of key species that tend to be pretty sensitive to grazing by domestic livestock. So we get this double whammy. We lose the habitat and we lose the forage source for the species while the invasives are coming in. Therefore, once again, changing the dynamics with the fire. I might say, prior to these invasive species, the sagebrush fire was a natural part of the ecosystem. And many of we found in areas that are ungrazed with fire, we'll see a recovery of both the sagebrush as well as these key sage grouse forage species, forb species in particular, that will come back quite readily. So there's it's a very complicated, complex interaction of natural ecosystem processes and how domestic livestock alter these ecosystem processes. And the sage grouse are but one of the many indicators with their decline. It's just indicators of decline in the integrity of these habitats.
Briefly, if somebody could touch on what the sage grouse plans are, what do they seek to do, and have they been successful at recovering the bird?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Back in the mid 2010s, the Obama administration decided to embark upon the sage grouse range-wide plan amendments. And now I have to cop a plea, and I don't think I've ever publicly admitted this, but the sage grouse plan amendments are probably my fault because I was the original person who went to the U.S. Department of Interior and said, well, gee, if you had range-wide plans for sage grouse that ramped up protections for the bird and fostered their recovery, then you wouldn't need to list them under the Endangered Species Act. And then about 6 months later, and completely unrelated and unbeknownst to me, Mark Salvo, who was then working, I think, for the Sagebrush Sea Project, approached the Interior Department and asked for the exact same thing. And you know what? We got what we wished for. And the process initially started out very well, where the Bureau of Land Management undertook what it called the National Technical Team Report and reviewed all the available sage grouse literature and came up with a variety of recommendations, which by and large were exactly what the science said that the grouse needed. And it was the first and maybe only time in my career that I saw the Bureau of Land Management do a competent job of assessing the science. They did a good job of saying what sage grouse need. And then the Obama administration took that forward, but somewhere along the way, the process kind of got hijacked politically by forces that wanted the plans to basically defer to the states and do whatever the states wanted to do for sage grouse instead of giving the birds what they needed based on their biological requirements. And so when that happened, you started whittling away at these protections, putting in waivers, exceptions, and modifications, all kinds of compromise. And in the end, you got this sage grouse plan west-wide that obviously wasn't up to the level that sage grouse required to continue to live on their habitats. And some environmental groups got behind the Obama administration and said, hooray, it's all over. The sage grouse have won. And Western Watersheds Project and my organization at the time, Wild Earth Guardians and Center for Biological Diversity, and some other groups sent out a press release saying, no, this is an epic failure and a blown opportunity on the part of the Obama administration. And I think when you look at the declines that happened from 2015 to the present, which have been now well documented, I think time has proven us right. Not only have these plan amendments not saved the sage grouse and recovered them back to healthy levels, they were unable to even keep them at the levels we had back in 2015 when the plans were completed.
Let's talk about sage grouse's habitat needs, maybe throughout their life cycles. Does anyone want to touch on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, once again, sage grouse, is truly one of the sagebrush obligate species. They typically will nest in either low sage or Wyoming big sage, requiring good nesting cover. Again, their chicks require a tremendous insect forage base to survive, and a forb base, as I was discussing earlier, in that critical part of the year when they're fledging and growing. And this is where healthy riparian zones come in that those are also very good sources of both insects as well as key sage grouse forage species during the summer months. Moving into the winter months, they're going to tend to spend most of their time again in the sagebrush, where sagebrush becomes a very important forage source. And this is also where, if we start to lose these key winter habitats due to land conversion, like converting to cheatgrass or through fire and converting to exotic species, we lose the habitat for the species. So it's very incumbent upon us to try to maintain this diversity, this diverse matrix of the important and key sagebrush habitats that vary through the year and vary through the natural home range of the sage grouse in any sort of land management activity.
As you mentioned, Eric, the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a finding that the greater sage grouse, is warranted for listing. Why has this not happened, and are livestock interest involved in this impasse?
Well, certainly, the livestock industry is in it up to its neck, and so is the oil and gas industry, and both of those industries were putting tremendous pressure on all of the politicians that were involved, both at the federal and state levels, in sage grouse conservation. In terms of why we don't have the sage grouse listed under the Endangered Species Act, I think the Obama administration decided that its plans were going to be an adequate regulatory mechanism to provide the protection to restore sage grouse populations. That was a mistake, it turned out. The history has proven them wrong. But at the same time they rolled out the sage grouse plans in 2015, they also rolled out a not warranted finding for the sage grouse based on those plans, and stating that because we now have these plans, therefore we can not list the greater sage grouse. But then even before they reached this particular point, in 2014, Congress stepped in, worried about the possibility of a sage grouse listing, understanding that sage grouse inhabited a 10-state area, including a lot of the areas where the oil and gas and livestock industries did business, and worried that sage grouse conservation could be economically inconvenient for these industries. Congress stepped in, and during a CR omnibus spending bill, attached a rider that basically said that there can be no money spent on the listing of greater sage grouse indefinitely. And that rider has been reintroduced with each additional appropriations bill in every year since. There have been some years where a Democratic Senate has stripped it out, but then in conference committee, it gets reinserted. And so Congress is effectively blocking the ability of the Endangered Species Act to step in on behalf of the greater sage grouse and protect it.
Yeah.
Why are ranchers so concerned about the sage grouse being listed? Let's say public lands ranchers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's back up a little bit though and just talk about how many we're talking about. We that's probably 2% of all livestock operators in the United States, and even in places like Oregon, it's 8% of the livestock operators. So we have 92% of the livestock operators that aren't grazing on public land. So uh, livestock on public lands make up it's about 1.6% of the cattle in the Western United States. So we're dealing with a little tiny fraction. This is an amount that wouldn't even affect markets. But it's also true that livestock graze, 84, 85% of all public land. So obviously, the first step in ecological restoration is identify and halt those activities that are causing degradation of the ecosystem or of the habitat or of the endangered species. Halt those activities that are causing the damage or preventing the recovery. Uh, Clearly, the dominant land use in this in the sage grouse habitat is livestock. And it would just be, an obvious for the reasons that we talked about earlier of affecting the composition, the structure of the habitat. It's clear that it is the dominant impact causing the degradation, the ways to prevent recovery, as we have seen in those few large habitats where there aren't livestock grazing, as we do see recovery of the species of concern for the habitat species, the plant species, the plant structure, the plant cover, with cessation of grazing. So they might. So again, it's a vocal minority. They tend to have the ear of politicians, but it's really in terms of influencing uh, everyday consumers in America. Their impacts are far greater than their benefits. Not even to begin to mention some of the other impacts of biodiversity, loss of water quality, loss of exacerbating climate change, those sorts of impacts. So,
Well, let's talk about science. So I guess rangeland science specifically. What makes good science? What makes bad science? How should studies be properly designed and implemented?
yeah, yeah. Well, while we're talking about that on sage grouse, one of the things that, I mentioned earlier that at least 85% of the public lands in the West are being grazed by livestock. That's a tiny fraction aren't being grazed. And if you get to areas such as Eastern Oregon, there is even less that's ungrazed. So there's a paucity of sage grouse habitat, large swaths of land that are protected. Hart Mountain is actually one of the few areas in southeastern Oregon that is a large landscape where we have entire watersheds that aren't grazed. These are the sorts of scientific controls we need, large ungrazed controls that we could make adequate comparisons to current management of the landscape. So there's a vast shortage of suitable replicated experiments that we could conduct. But much of what Eric and I have talked about today has been, decades and decades of sage grouse research on what are their key habitats, what are their key forbs, what are their key nesting requirements, their lek area requirements. All of these we have pretty good data on. It's the other aspects of how do we start to restore the sage grouse habitat? What is the best way to move forward? And we're seeing very, very few studies directed towards true ecosystem recovery and or maintenance of the intact ecosystems that where they exist as well. where healthy populations of sage grouse exist.
And in addition to needing to have good, kind of ungrazed baselines
Yeah.
to comparison, if you're going to have good science, you want to have objective science. You want to start from, a standpoint of deductive reasoning. In other words, you start with a question, you have a fair test of the hypothesis, you take rigorous and random sampling of the habitat variables you need to answer the question. You subject it to statistics, and you find out if you have significant results. The opposite of that is called inductive reasoning, where you start with your conclusion and then you go out and try and find evidence to support that conclusion. And that's, of course, how a lot of Facebook and other social media arguments proceed, but it's not the way that science is supposed to proceed. On the other hand, we do see a little bit of evidence that, we're starting to have that inductive reasoning starting to creep into science in some cases where, folks seem to be starting from a conclusion and then, trying to set up experiments that will demonstrate that conclusion, or having a scientific experiment that sets up and gets results that are unbiased, and then misinterpreting on purpose those results so that
Right.
you get the answer that you were hoping for.
Yeah. Or even some sort of self-censorship. Quite often you'll see in the literature, and particularly in sage grouse reports by federal and state agencies, is that they'll talk about, well, the habitat, what are the key factors limiting sage grouse or causing their decline, declines in habitat, and they'll talk about invasive species, they'll talk about fire, loss of suitable nesting or lek habitats, but they'll never mention the root cause of that. What causes those issues? They're talking about the symptoms, but not really addressing the cause of those symptoms. And that, particularly in Oregon, much of Idaho, everywhere where there's not oil is going to be largely the vast majority of the land is affected by livestock grazing, cattle grazing. So.
And in conservation, we joke that that's the ABCs of land management. The problem is anything but cows.
Yeah.
It should be pretty clear to anyone paying attention that industry, livestock in this instance, has captured the land management agencies. They work hand in hand with industry, two sides of the same coin. With that said, should the public be immediately skeptical of any studies that are funded by industry? Erik, you actually gave a presentation on this at the Healthy Public Lands Conference in Salt Lake City this year.
Well, one of the recent studies that was funded by the livestock industry, at least in part, was a study that was completed, at least in draft form, and put out as a white paper out of the University of Idaho, and it was looking at grazing in Idaho. And what they did was they took a look at livestock grazing in a handful of different allotments in different places, and they made the argument that livestock grazing didn't have any significant ecological effect, and in fact might even be beneficial. Well, if you look at the parameters of that study,
Right.
the level of grazing that they were authorizing on those allotments that they were testing was universally below 30% forage utilization, which is less than a third of the grass that they're taking off of the range every year. And I think, in fact, those allotments averaged 18% forage utilization. And they said, well, this is representative of public lands livestock grazing throughout the region. Well, in fact, what's representative of public lands livestock grazing throughout the region is grazing leases that authorize the livestock permittee to take off 50 to 65% forage utilization, or more than twice as much as what was measured in this study. And not only that, but the Bureau of Land Management isn't really watching to make sure that the livestock grazing is limited to that 50 to 65%. And often the forage utilization we're seeing on the ground is a lot more than that. So, in this case, that's a study where you had statistical testing that looked okay, but the conclusions didn't actually match the results in any way, shape, or form. They basically misinterpreted their own results.
Yeah. And again, you can also look at, livestock aren't aren't lawnmowers, just like any other animal. They have their preferences, they have their habitat preferences, they have their limitations. These are animals that were bred for meat production, not for moving around the rangelands, and they're pretty much limited to or they certainly are going to prefer areas like the riparian zones. These are the sites that are going to get really grazed pretty heavily. This is also the areas that are perhaps habitat for 85 to 90% of the wildlife species out there. So if you're just measuring utilization in the uplands, but not impacts on stream banks, which would be affecting, desert fish and the aquatic flora, but you need to look at how variable is this utilization across the landscape, and what are the impacts in some of these key habitats in the sagebrush landscape in particular. And I'm very skeptical that the variables that one might select, the habitats that one might select, can result in like Erik said, a misinterpretation of the true impacts of the land use on the ecosystem.
So we're talking about the Conway 2025 paper now.
That's right.
Anything of note about the authors of that paper? Have they published other research?
Well, one of the co-authors in that particular study is a researcher by the name of Karen Launchbaugh, who kind of very famously has made a career out of putting out studies that are very supportive of and beloved by the livestock industry. And one of the other studies that she put out that I think is very notable is she had a graduate student by the name of Kawek that put out a study of the comparative effects of feral horses and cattle on riparian areas in the Owyhee Canyonlands region. And one of the things that was really interesting about that study was that right in the methods, and they admitted this right in the paper, and it got, published even through peer review. It said, we identified our sampling sites by asking ranchers and BLM employees where we should sample. In other words, they made no effort to have a random sampling of where they should sample. Well, when you're looking at the comparison of the impacts of wild horses and cattle, one of the things that you would know, if you know that issue, is that wild horses come to the same spot to water habitually, day after day after day.
Mm-hmm.
So along a particular stream or river, you could have miles of no impact by wild horses and then have one spot that has all kinds of heavy impact. Well, if you ask the Bureau of Land Management or the ranchers where you should sample to have wild horse impact, even if innocently they're just saying, well, this is where you would go to see the wild horses, they would point you to these hot spots where the wild horses come to water habitually. And that's going to overrepresent the riparian impact of wild horses and underrepresent the comparative impact of the cattle on that same, riverbed. Versus if you had randomly, taken a random numbers table and, had sampling locations all the way up and down the stream, picked at random, you might not even find a place that had wild horse impacts on that riparian area, or you might, but it might be a lot lighter. And certainly, on average, the cattle compared to the wild horses would be much heavier impact. They manufactured that outcome by basically cherry picking the places that they sampled based on the recommendations of BLM officials and ranchers, both of which, by the way, have had a, kind of a vested interest in pointing the finger at wild horses as a big ecological problem, as a way of getting the attention drawn away from cattle and sheep.
Yeah, I might just add to that. If you just look at, say, BLM's, environmental analyses of land use, quite often they're allocating up to 86%. Say this is one example from the Lakeview district of the BLM. 86 of the forage allocated to livestock, maybe 5 to 10% to horses, and just maybe 5 to 10%. I can't remember the exact numbers to antelope and deer. and 2% to the other wildlife. And this is so the vast majority of the forage is allocated to the a very tiny number of permittees and their cattle, to the detriment of all the other animals that are out there on the public's land.
So let's go back to the Conway 2025 study and talk about who funded, who backed the study. So the Public Lands Council, and they're a public lands livestock industry organization, the Idaho Cattle Association, and cooperative ranchers throughout the state of Idaho. How does this play into the bias? And it was interesting, looking at a caveat that they said in their results that they're only relevant to grazing at levels included in this study, and we did talk a bit about that, which did not make the headlines. So, any thoughts about who funded or backed this study and how that plays into the conversation?
Well, Boone, I'd like to get you to answer this question because you've been inside these research institutions and you've seen some of the things that happen behind the scenes, and maybe you'd be willing to talk about some of
Yeah, actually, where I worked, the livestock industry, didn't really fund that much research. I would say that with the caveat, there is a lot of self-censorship amongst the range community and amongst the wildlife community, for that matter. Of it's not in your best professional interest to go up against these strong moneyed interests that will ask for your head on a platter to the dean if you do speak out, say, against these very powerful agricultural interests. I think that it's also quite interesting to look at. You can take these numbers that quite often livestock interest may fund, but start looking at the data and do a further analysis of the data. For example, there was a study a couple of years ago about how important, an economic study of how important livestock was on public lands to the to local communities, direct impacts, how much is it directly to the livestock producer, the monetary value, and what are the indirect impacts? Well, we just made some very simple comparisons of the social carbon cost, how livestock may be affecting climate change, and just the social carbon cost alone, which is that's the cost of the loss of carbon stocks, the ability to these rangelands to sequester carbon, the increased carbon that's lost, greater greenhouse gas emissions when livestock are on the area. Livestock are tremendous producers of greenhouse gas emissions. The impacts to future generations, and generations being very, very current as well as future, is greater, far greater from an economic standpoint than the benefits. So again, how you interpret the data is every bit as important as who's perhaps funding the data. What the conclusions are going to be if indeed you're getting to the final result. It's hard to, even with data ownership by the scientists, the need and the fear, I think, to continue getting funding in the future, and the fear of perhaps even losing your job may influence how you end up writing your paper.
And it's also worth noting that there are entire research arms that are dedicated to, kind of promoting the livestock industry. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture has an agricultural research station in Southeast Oregon that pumps out study after study, Kirk Davies and others, promoting narratives that they're really favorable to the livestock industry and promoting cattle grazing as some kind of ecological solution to everything from fire to cheatgrass. And these results certainly don't stand up against all the other bodies of science that are out there in the world, but they do get a lot of press because then the cattle industry will seize them and do press releases on them and put them into the media. So the politicians hear a lot about these, and that affects public policy. I think you can also look at what Boone was saying about professional intimidation by industries. And I'll give you one example that really stands out to me, is the example of Dr. Rob Wilgus at the Washington State University. He was doing wolf research up in northeastern Washington, along the Canadian border, in an area where the livestock permittees were actively doing things like turning out their cattle right on top of wolf den sites, or placing salt blocks near wolf rendezvous points in order to create conflicts between the wolves and the cattle, which they could then turn into an excuse to get the wolves taken out. So Wilgus actually went public with this knowledge that he had discovered during his field research. And what happened? Well, a former rancher and state legislator by the name of Kretz went to Washington State University and said, if you don't shut this Wilgus down and fire him, I am going to block the funding for your new medical school. And then Wilgus's dean said, well, we're going to back you on this, but we're going to divert your funding, and we're going to cut off the funding to your wolf research program to appease this legislator. And Wilgus ended up in a hostile work environment where he couldn't get his research done, and ended up basically getting pushed out of his research position. And he ended up suing the university, won a $300,000 settlement, but he was effectively silenced because he's not doing research anymore on wolves or on the impacts of the livestock industry on wolf populations. And that's what, scientific researchers have to look forward to if they tell the truth about politically powerful and well-connected industries like the livestock industry, like the mining industry, like the oil and gas industry. If you go to the University of Wyoming, there's an entire book called Behind the Carbon Curtain, by Dr. Lockwood, Jeff Lockwood, who works there and has tenure and can't be fired. But he exposed all kinds of political corruption in that university, and harassment, and even dismissal of people who were putting out research that supported climate change and supported the negative impacts of the fossil fuel industry in that case.
It's a broken system. It's a flywheel, right? So these studies come out, and there's all this influence by and hands in and on the science of the process. And then these studies get used by the land management agencies as they do their permit renewals or changes in management. So it's a tough nut to crack. Has this Conway paper been peer reviewed yet? I know for a while it hasn't been.
It hasn't been, but there's been an announcement by the researchers that they are going to start submitting it for peer review. And so we should be getting some peer review publications. I think that it was interesting that they rolled out the press release for this study before they went through peer review. So, could they get the conclusions that they reached in their white paper through peer review, and to get peer reviewers to sign off on those, given the fact that their data didn't actually support those? Well, maybe, maybe not. Peer review isn't what it used to be. It's become more perfunctory. The number of journals has, really grown. There are some issues with not very thorough peer review processes. But one of the problems that we're facing here is not just that we're getting bad science through that then has misleading results that aren't credible, but then when you expose the corruption that might be behind some of this science, it doesn't just stick to that scientific publication. There's a danger that you can undermine the validity of science writ large. And there are a great number of scientific researchers that are out there doing an honest job of testing hypotheses in an independent and unbiased way and interpreting their conclusions correctly. And there's robust scientific debate that can go on that can often correct these things. But, it's a kind of a conundrum if you're a scientist like myself who's now working in nonprofit conservation, and you can see the impact of these misleading scientific studies that are disproportionately finding their way in front of policymakers and changing the decisions that are made at the highest levels. And how do you correct the record without sending the inadvertent message that, gee, you can't trust science generally? Because if you can't trust science generally, then anyone's opinion is just as valid as anyone else's opinion, and truth goes right down the drain.
How do we fix this?
Well, unfortunately, I think we're going in the wrong direction right now with the current administration, actually defunding, a great deal of our science has come from federal sources in the past, like National Science Foundation, even NASA has funded a great deal of research in the American West. Other federal agencies and Forest Service and BLM has, funded good studies, and these are drying up now. There's been a Republican war on science for the last 20, 30, 40 years, since certainly the second Bush administration, and it's just gone into hyperdrive now with not only defunding, but just eliminating the agencies, eliminating the ability even for these agencies to do a modicum of land management and practically no science. Even our colleagues in the federal research agencies, EPA, Forest Service again, USGS Biological Resources Division, all of these have been severely cut in the last year. And this should be of great concern to anybody concerned with natural resources and the future of our forest and range lands in the American West, because with no scientific overlook, no professional management overlook, you can't have there should be great concern of the pathway in which our lands are going to be headed. The trajectory of species such as sage grouse or even their entire landscapes are certainly more at risk than they've ever been in my career anyway.
And to me, if you're looking at how do you fix this problem, with science that's struggling in some cases, I think the solution ultimately is more science, because if you can have more science and you have more researchers critically looking at some of these spurious results that are being published and replicating those studies and finding different results. I can give you an example. Back in the early 2000s, there was a scientist, a geneticist for hire named Rob Roy Ramey, who was hired by the university or by the state of Wyoming to analyze the genetics of the Preble's meadow jumping mouse with the hopes of finding that it wasn't a legitimate subspecies and didn't need to be listed on the Endangered Species Act. Well, Dr. Ramey did his study, and he was able to find that really this Preble's meadow jumping mouse was no different from the Bear Lodge meadow jumping mouse, and therefore it wasn't a legitimate subspecies. But in that case, there was more science, because there was a USGS scientist by the name of Clarence King who decided, I'm going to take a look at the request of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who found Dr. Ramey's results to be fishy. I'm going to take a look at the exact same study specimens that Dr. Ramey sampled for his genetics, and looking at the exact same mice doing the exact same tests in the exact same way. He found radical differences in the genetics between the Preble's meadow jumping mouse and the Bear Lodge meadow jumping mouse. And this was then followed by a 5-expert panel, a review panel, to figure out exactly what had gone wrong, that these two studies that had sampled the exact same mice with the exact same techniques came up with completely diametrically opposed results. And what they found was that Dr. Ramey had contaminated his samples of Preble meadow jumping mice with Bear Lodge meadow jumping mouse genetic material. Now, whether that was accidentally on purpose or whether that was incompetence, we'll never know. It's one or the other. But what it does show is that with enough scientific replication of that same experiment, that if you can't get the same results as the original assertion, then that points to some problem or some other factor that needs explanation. And that's where we need to have that kind of extra science to, so that science can do its job to police itself. Yeah. And the other thing that we need is we need to armor these research institutions from political meddling. And one of the problems in big land grant universities is they tend to be publicly funded, which means that there's a politician somewhere who's deciding whether they get an appropriation or not. And then that puts pressure on the university president or the dean or the other administrators that are in charge of directing their researchers in their departments. And if you don't have political pressure on academic institutions to come up with one answer or another, or to tell you, oh, you shouldn't tell me that the oil and gas industry is the problem. That's the wrong answer. You better not find that. Then you're not going to have this kind of selective self-silencing and self-censorship that Dr. Kauffman is talking about that's so pervasive in Western land-grant universities. I think we need more academic freedom. I think we need more, if you will, a sort of scientific Magna Carta that protects and defends researchers that find controversial results that offend politically powerful interests, because we need all truths to be out there, not just those that are politically convenient.
Yeah. And of course, I think that once again we're seeing that we're taking the wrong direction at this point in time with even greater scrutiny and less greater threats to the tenure system. I clearly wouldn't have been able to maintain my job at Oregon State University were it not for tenure. But I also always felt it very important to publish my science. And when a lot of my work and research has always been asking the questions is, how does land use affect biological diversity, affect the species? What are the steps towards sustainable, ecologically based restoration or conservation of ecosystems? Quite often, there have been a number of user groups everywhere from the shrimp industry in Southeast Asia to the livestock industry in Oregon who have called for my head on a platter or to be removed from the university. But again, if you're publishing in peer-reviewed journals from reputable research sources, my funding source, I never had any difficulty in obtaining funding usually through competitive grants, where you have to demonstrate that your science is well replicated, well designed, before you even begin to conduct it. You're undergoing intensive peer review. That is how I think some of the best science is put forward. And again, I just might add that some of what we know about sage grouse, what we know about the ecology and diversity of the sagebrush ecosystems, old growth forest, that came from federally funded research funds. So there has been a lot of good. There still is a lot of good that comes out of the universities and the peer review process. It's just that, if anything, I think it's the self-censorship quite often associated with, one of the most glaring examples, I think, is the self-censorship of livestock and sage grouse, our subject today.
Yeah, it's too bad science has turned into sort of a team sports sort of situation instead of trying to seek out the truth. Mm-hmm. I'd like to see public debate when these controversies arise, like this one, for instance. I think that's so important. I saw a story a colleague wrote in Colorado. He got some public records requests back from the state, and he saw some communications, and he works on forest issues, and he saw some communications back and forth among officials, really concerned about ever having to publicly debate independent science on forest management, active forest management, as it pertains to wildfire mitigation, because they think they could very well lose that debate. So, there's fear out there, but somehow we got to break through that and just be willing to put ideas forward and to test those ideas on the public stage.
Yeah, I do agree that that is good. We do need more dialogue, more debate, more hashing out the issues, discussing shortcomings, discussing research needs. I mean, coming back to what we talked about earlier, to understand, to restore the sage grouse, we need to restore the habitat, to maintain the habitat, and what are the approaches that we should be taking, and what is truly causing the damage. And that is certainly one of the ways I would suggest that we could move forward in a collaborative nature.
Well, one other question comes to mind, unless you guys think of anything else, but how do we best disseminate information that refutes livestock industry propaganda and tells the story about public lands grazing impacts to sage grouse and the ecosystems that support them?
Well, podcasts such as this, I suppose, it's quite often the voice trying to get we publish, has it, 200, 300 papers in my career. And it's quite often they'll get buried in the scientific literature. A few people will read them, few of my peers, other colleagues, people interested in my field of science, but it's really hard to get these out to the press releases, the public, let the public know. And the public has a right to know. It's their tax dollars that went in to funding these studies. We do need to improve our capacity to disseminate relevant information that is of interest to anybody concerned with America's natural resources.
And I think, for my money, one of the best ways to tell the truth about the livestock industry and its impacts is through that published science. And Boone, you've had several publications that I can think of over the years that have been, made the case really strongly in an independent, unbiased way. That then conservation groups like Western Watersheds Project or Oregon Natural Desert Association or the American Bird Conservancy can then bring into the public policy debate. And I think that there's an interesting ability for conservation nonprofits, if we're kind of actively reading the scientific literature and discovering the seminal studies that affect those policy decisions that are right on the cusp of these big natural resource questions. If we can bring those into the media, sometimes the environmental NGOs can amplify the science and have had an ability to do that over the years. And that's been effective as well. But I think that it is very worth considering that if I say, that livestock grazing is having a negative impact on sage grouse, even though I might be a published moose biologist, nobody knows that. People look at me and they say, "Oh, you're an environmentalist. You must be biased in favor of environmental stuff." It's better if I can point to an unbiased researcher from an academic institution saying the same thing. That same message will be received in a very different way from policymakers.
Well, any other thoughts? Anything to conclude with? It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
No, it's a tremendous task. I think in front of us. I think we're in a time now of unprecedented threats to our public lands at a time when we see ignoring some of the big issues, while we're talking about livestock grazing, that their impacts are going to be so much more detrimental to the native ecosystems and biodiversity of our public lands with climate change. We're seeing, greater fire severity, greater droughts, greater temperatures. All of this is having pretty dramatic impacts in many direct and even and without a doubt unforeseen ways. And this is all coming at a time. So now we're seeing a decline in our ability to manage these lands, a decline in our incredible scientific needs at this point in history, and very little support and certainly a dwindling support at the federal level for both science and land management, effective land management. It should be of great concern to anybody in America right now.
And as far as sage grouse are concerned, when I started working on sage grouse in 2001, there was a relatively limited body of scientific literature on sage grouse, and the bird was virtually unknown, not just in conservation circles, but in land management circles. And nothing was really being done to protect it, even though the species was declining and first really was identified as a candidate for endangered species listing in the early 2000s, shortly after I started working on the bird. And through time, over the last 20 years, there's been a tremendous body of scientific literature that's been pumped out on the reasons for sage grouse declines, the magnitude of sage grouse declines, the human-caused impacts that affect and cause sage grouse declines. And so now I feel like we have pretty much all the science we need to save the sage grouse and put it onto a path and a trajectory of recovery. What we need now is political will. What we need now is decision makers that have the backbone and the vision to say, we're going to do what it takes to save the sage grouse. And if they do that and they implement the scientific knowledge that we already have, we can bring this bird from the brink of extinction back into abundance. And along with it, we can bring forth a renovation of the sagebrush sea, the likes of which nobody has seen for more than a century. We can bring back an entire ecosystem by doing what we need to protect the greater sage grouse. All it takes is politicians that are more concerned with having healthy ecosystems, healthy lands, and abundant wildlife than they are with having very profitable industries that are parasitizing our public lands.
Well said. Well, Boone and Erik, it's been great. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks, Boone, for coming on.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's always good to see you all. So